Where are we?
This is a podcast, Dan.
Oh, okay. What are we talking about?
We're introducing ourselves in the podcast and then discussing a couple of topics, such as what it's like to study personal finance and apply it, the importance of staying on top of your personal finances, and some of the challenges that can arise if you don't stay on top of something like your estate plan.
Okay, well, can we at least turn on the lights and have a catchy theme song?
Let's.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Welcome. I'm Dan Yerger.
And I'm Emily Green.
And this is the Science of Wealth podcast, but I guess some introductions are probably in order.
Yeah. What's your role around here, Dan?
My job on the podcast is to answer questions, but otherwise I am the founder and lead wealth planner at My Wealth Planners in Longmont, Colorado.
How long have you been in financial planning?
I have been a planner pushing about 10 years now. I got licensed originally in 2015 and then started the practice that became My Wealth Planners back in 2019.
Why did you get into this business?
Why does anybody get into this business? Money, fame, fortune. No, realistically, I studied finance in grad school and ultimately decided that I wanted to work in a part of finance where I got to see the impact on individuals' lives, as opposed to working in sort of high finance where it's all big, billion-dollar numbers, but there's no people behind it.
That's a pretty good reason. Well, what are you doing these days in financial planning?
Teaching you to be a financial planner and otherwise working with about 150 clients here in Longmont. And then otherwise, I'm working on my PhD in financial planning. I'm all but dissertation, so I'll be Dr. Dan here sooner than later.
Well, that's a pretty decent list. Okay.
Yeah, it's not bad. Well, your turn. What is it that you do here, Emily?
I'm a financial planning assistant, yours specifically.
That's why I recognize you. Super easy. Well, then why did you choose to get into financial planning, since I know for a fact you did not start your career in financial planning?
I did not. I have a background. My degree is all medical. But then a few years ago, I purchased a small business. I owned a coffee shop for a few years, which I have since sold. But that kind of piqued my interest in something other than the medical that I was doing. And I realized that there was a lot I didn't know. And even after selling the business, there was a lot I could have done differently and better had I known better and had more education and all that. And I've kind of taken on an interest in helping other people with their finances. And I really enjoy seeing the impact it has on people's whole life. I missed out on some opportunities and could have done things better, but now I can help other people.
Very nice. And, what are you doing right now in terms of what you're learning and studying in financial planning?
I have my FPQP certification and I just finished the retirement planning class at CU. Currently, I'm doing my securities studies and studying for the Series 7. I won't sit for it, but then I'll study for the Series 65 and actually sit for that, be licensed, and become an associate planner. It's the next step.
Okay. Well, terrific. Well, before we go on, I think it's probably good to just talk to the audience here for a second and explain who we think this podcast is going to be good for. So I think this is good for a couple audiences. First and foremost, I think this is going to be a good podcast if you just want to learn about personal finance from people who make a living advising people around their personal finances. So investments, insurance, estate, tax, cash management, all that stuff is something that we work on daily as financial planners. And so I think this will be a good podcast for folks to learn about those topics. This is going to be a good podcast for people who are either in the process of becoming a financial planner or who are in the early days of being a financial planner. So whether that means you're looking to do a career change or you're currently a financial planning student or you've started a financial advisor job and you're not quite sure if you're a product salesperson or a financial advisor or a financial planner who actually does financial planning, I think this might be enlightening for some folks out there as well.
Probably will be.
Hopefully, we'll find out. So let's go ahead and start by just talking about one of your recent learning experiences. So you just took the retirement planning class up at CU. Tell us a little bit about your class experience as a whole and some of the stuff you learned about.
Class experience as a whole was new and different. I graduated from college the first time 10 years ago now. There's a big difference, at least to me personally, between going to school as a teenager versus going now that I'm almost 30. And actually, understanding at a deeper level that I need to understand it. I'm not just memorizing facts to pass a test. It's something I'm going to have to apply in my daily life and understand thoroughly. So I'd say I go at it much more seriously, and I get a lot more out of the class than I did the first time I went to school. So that's been a big comparison for me. And then, of course, the material is totally different. My classes before were all medical, and now it's finance. And you're my teacher.
Yeah. So spoilers or confessions here. I teach the retirement planning class up at CU Boulder. So, you obviously are in a different place as a student. You're learning it for different reasons, right? It's part of your job to learn these subjects as opposed to just trying to get a grade. What did we cover in the class that you thought was maybe something that you really should just know about, whether you're as a financial planner or just as an individual?
Honestly, before taking the class and working here, but I didn't realize how many rules there were around retirement accounts and how difficult it can be and how many penalties there are to taking money out of them. And then the obvious big one, the importance of compounding interest and starting young, which everyone told me, you hear about it. Yeah, start as young as you can. And I kind of thought, well, that's great, but I don't have enough extra money. I'll start later. I'll do it next year. And I kind of wish I'd done it earlier.
Sure. I think the interesting thing about the starting it earlier thing is that I don't know many people who didn't get the compounding interest talk at some point. Like my parents, I think my dad got me the Rich Dad, Poor Dad book, which is terrible, by the way, but it was well intended. It was a good gift. And it talks about compounding interest and investing early and getting all that stuff done. But life gets in the way. You go to school, and whether you're paying for it yourself or you have a scholarship or your parents helping pay for it, and you jump off into adulthood, or if you didn't go to college, you just jump straight into adulthood and you're kind of responsible for all your own expenses. And by the time you make even kind of a good first job, whatever that means for you individually, that now you've got to pay rent, and you've got to maybe pay for a car loan, or maybe you have student loans, and you're just trying to enjoy life still because you're still kind of an adolescent in many ways. And it's really hard to start saving. And when you start saving, it seems like it doesn't do very much. It doesn't go very far, and it seems a little bit silly. But every person we talk to as financial planners who are in their 50s or 60s or well into retirement, without fail, right? The batting average here is 1,000. Everybody wishes they'd saved more. Everybody wishes they'd saved earlier. It's just such a common issue that we run into, that no one started as early or as quickly or as much as they feel like they should have in hindsight.
Yeah. I guess I always thought it as an extra thing. Like, as you said, after I pay off this car, or, I bought a business, so I was reinvesting anything extra I had into the business. And I thought, well, after the first few years when we're making more and I feel comfortable, then I will. And there's always something coming up. It's like, well, after this, I'm going to open a retirement account. And then my 20s passed by and I didn't do that.
Funny how time flies by when you're having fun. Yeah. I think that's the expression.
Yeah. Working hard and having a lot of fun.
Well, I mean, at least it was fun and it wasn't all hard work. But obviously, as you learn and as time goes on, right, other things start to become bigger priorities. I think another thing that I observe as faculty teaching that type of class is, as you already described, a lot of students are just there to learn what they need to pass a test. And even if they're going to become financial planners, not all of them take it as seriously as they should. And of those who aren't, but are just taking it as a class to learn about retirement planning, many of them don't seem to think that it applies to them. And compounding interest and investing early is such a common thing, but they'll take lessons from anything from Roth IRAs versus doing a 401k, or the difference between taking a job that has a pension versus a profit sharing plan or a 401k. And it just sort of goes in one ear and out the other sometimes. And I get a chuckle out of that a little bit, because a common thing that we hear from not clients, but just in the public, particularly as financial planners, is there's so many influencers out there selling a one size fits all vision of finance. If you just read my book or follow my blog or listen to my podcast, irony noted, you will learn everything you need to know about personal finance and you'll be fine. You'll do great. You'll do wonderfully. And that's just not the reality. When I see most people, there are definitely people at the end of the bell curve who are doing finance really well on their own. They're just crushing it and good for them. But I think a lot of people confuse just saving or just having money with being financially successful or with doing their own finances as well as they could, and they don't have the skill set or the context to know whether that's true or not.
I think they also don't know how to scale it up, because I certainly didn't. My mom tried to teach me at a young age. She said, always save 10% of your income into a savings account no matter what. And I did that diligently, always. And I thought, well, I'm doing that. I'm set. I saved 10%. I'm not doing too bad.
Well, and kudos to you for saving 10%. But I mean, even in your particular kind of personal example, right? What was one of the very first things that we figured out about how you save when you started this job?
I mean, several things, but one, I was just putting it into a savings account. I wasn't investing it. I was literally just saving it.
And, on top of that, right, a savings account is great, but you were getting essentially no interest on it. So even though you were doing the responsible thing of saving money, you were actually losing money, technically. You had it, your balance was never going down, but your purchasing power was going away even as you were saving.
Yeah. And that was not something I'd ever thought of. And, I don't think I even realized the rates that a high yield savings account had. I knew they existed. I'd heard of them. And I just didn't take that extra step to look into it and open one. And I remember starting here, and you brought it up. We were talking about my situation, and you said, well, is it in a high yield? I said, no, but I saved 10% always into the bank. And you were like, very patient and kind about it, but you were like, you should change that. That's not great.
Yep. Well, and at the end of the day, you were doing one part of it right, but that's just a tiny example of something where, I mean, I've had clients who had north of $200,000 essentially just like sitting in their checking account. Like they weren't saving it deliberately. They just didn't spend all their money. And so they were saving sort of on accident. But then, I can't even begin to imagine how much money they might have had if they had been putting it to work. I mean, we even had a client a couple of years ago who had over $2 million just sitting in like checking and savings. And there's just comes a point where you go, okay, you've got to do something with it. If you just let it sit here, even if the pile is getting bigger, the value of the pile is shrinking at the same time.
Was it a safety thing with them? I don't know the person you're referencing, but there's always that fear of I've invested my money, I could lose my money.
No, well, let me rephrase. I think that was part of it to start with, and then it just became a habit. Again, the numbers are going up, right? Our wealth is building, our account balance is building, nothing bad is happening. So, inertia takes hold, and just suddenly 15, 20 years later, you've saved $2 million, between your income and your business and whatever else. And you could have $3, $4, $5, $6 million by that point, depending on how the markets have been and what you've put your money into. But at the end of the day, you do just have to put it to work. And if you let it sit for too long, it's going to lose its value.
That's true.
No. And I think that's also another thing. We tend to, I think, sometimes become victims of where we are in life. And what I mean by that is just, as financial planners, sometimes we fall into the trap of just doing it the way we learned it and not really evolving. But when it comes to personal finance, I think the version of that is people get comfortable. The analogy I've always liked to use is, just because you're not drowning doesn't mean you're a competitive swimmer. Right. So plenty of people are able to pay their bills. They're saving their 10%, or they're putting, whatever the match required amount is into their 401k. They're paying down their mortgage. They don't have a lot of credit card debt. So they're just doing fine. They have a perfectly adequate quality of life and a decent financial position, and they don't know any better. And then they're none the wiser as to what mistakes or omissions or errors they're making along the way.
Yeah, that sounds right. I think I did a lot of that in other ways too. I have a tendency to pay down debt, even if it has a fairly low interest rate, just because I think I was raised that way. My mom really pushed the whole Dave Ramsey thing, get rid of your debt. And it's not always actually the most optimal choice, but I've definitely done it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, being debt free is sort of this common American refrain. We're really well conditioned culturally to say, I want to be debt free. I don't want to have any debt, or debt is bad. And certainly certain types of debt are bad, or certain amounts of debt are bad just from a contextual standpoint. But otherwise, at the end of the day, it just doesn't make sense to take on more debt than is necessary. But at the same time, when you have something like a savings account that can pay 4%, and you've got a mortgage at 2.5% because you bought a house in 2020 or something like that, there's free money in between those 2 points, at least as long as interest rates maintain. And though some people like to get ahead on paying down their debts or their mortgages, you could get there that much faster just by pocketing the difference in between those two numbers.
Yeah. I guess it's hard to visualize if you don't sit down and do the math sometimes.
Yeah. But even then, I think a lot of people also just lose track of where they are in their finances. I know we had a case recently where, well, why don't you tell them about that case?
Oh, from last week. Yeah, we met with somebody and she, had a pretty good grasp on certain aspects of her finances, but then there was about 3 big pieces of it that she just didn't know about. For example, her mortgage, she knew her interest rate situation, but she didn't know how much was left on it. She didn't know how much she had paid. She didn't really know where she stood with her housing. Also, she had paid into PARA. She'd been a teacher for a few years, but she didn't know how many years of service she had, which is a big deal in the PARA system. And also, she had been married for several years previously, but she wasn't sure if she qualified for her spouse's Social Security benefit or not, which would have made a huge difference for her financially. And she was aware of all of these things and the impact they would have on her cash flow right now and just her long-term planning. And she just still hadn't looked into it. A lot of like what I've done in the past, but she just surprisingly didn't know a lot about her own situation.
Yeah. And I think she's a good example of that, swimming and not drowning analogy. Not knowing like your mortgage balance. Like today, I couldn't tell you the exact amount I owe on my mortgage, but I have a very good idea of where it is. But something like working in PARA and whether you're eligible for an income benefit versus having to take a lump sum. And for anybody listening who's not aware, PARA is the Public Employees Retirement Association. It's what school teachers and city employees and a lot of people who work in the public sector in Colorado participate in. It's a big pension plan. And then there's also some 401k, 457 options out there for people who want to save more. That's a different conversation. But you have to work in it for at least 5 years to be eligible to receive an income benefit. And the difference there could be the difference between getting, even for working there 5 or 6 years, getting, let's say, a $15,000 lump sum versus getting paid out, something like $1,000 a month in retirement, which is going to take barely a year and a quarter to get caught up on compared to the lump sum value. So it can be a huge difference in just your retirement picture just by basically understanding, hey, do I need to work just 4 years or just 5 years to be eligible for a benefit? And then in the case of something like Social Security, I'm never going to tell somebody to stay married in a relationship that they don't want to be in, that they don't need to be in long term. In the case where they're not happy or something, but in this person's case, if they'd been married 10 years, they'd be eligible for their ex's Social Security benefit, which would have been huge compared to their own earnings, and they'd gotten divorced, 9 years and 4 months into it. And that's probably a several $1,000 difference in their own retirement picture once again, just because they, if they'd known at the time, it may not have been the deciding factor. But if I tell you, hey, you're going to get $2,000 a month or $500 a month in retirement if you can stick it out for a few months or just work it out a little bit longer, that's a huge, huge impact. It has massive financial implications for that individual simply because they're having a hard time keeping track of it, or they just don't know what they don't know.
Right. I have a question about the PARA, actually, skipping back to that. I know there's a way to look it up online, how many months of service you have in PARA, but do they ever just send out statements and let you know, or do you really have to track it down yourself?
They seem to send it out in chunks, and it's sort of an annoying system where they'll send you a statement that says, like, here's how much you've paid in for the last 12 months, and here's your current lump sum value. And I've seen some that have your start date on it, but not your crediting service time on it. And other times I've seen it with a crediting service. I don't know what the difference is or why those statements come out differently sometimes. But I've seen all sorts of versions of it where ultimately some people have, all the data you could possibly need on it and others don't. The one part that seems to always be missing is the estimate of income. And you can go on the PARA website and most pensions will have some sort of online tool for you to either get a quote or calculate and estimate what your benefit should be. But it's strange to me that those same statements don't just come out saying, hey, based on your earnings history and your contributions and your time and service and everything, here's your benefit. It's very strange to me they don't share that, but that is a very common thing that's missing. And so often some people will be like, well, I have, $30,000 in PARA and a question mark for my retirement income when I retire.
Is that benefit estimate calculator generally pretty accurate?
Yes, but it's only as accurate as the data you put into it. And what I found is a lot of people don't actually have the correct inputs. So they will, just take their current salary and throw it in there for the 3 years or the 4 years that they need to get the estimated value. and it'll throw out a number, but it's not actually technically correct. Or there's some things in para where if you have these big income jumps at different times, there can be sort of a cap on how much of the jump actually counts as an increase in salary. So there's just a couple nuances like that where the calculator is accurate with the data you give it, but the data you give it might not be very accurate.
Well, something to think about.
Yeah. Well, and I think in that same sense, another thing that sort of comes up in that world is, we work with a healthy number of teachers. I feel like we have an unspoken niche in like software developers who are married to teachers. We seem to have a lot of those in our client list. But in that particular context, the funny thing is that sometimes, particularly for either the teacher's spouse or if it's a single teacher, or we do have some clients who are married teachers, but quite often they'll feel like, we're not very wealthy. We don't do very well. And they're often discounting the entire value of their para pension. When you retire from para, if you've done 20, 30 years in it, you usually have a benefit that really, in a lump sum sense, it's not what they'd pay you. Like para won't write you $1 million check, but the income value is often worth well over $1 million. And I think that sometimes creates a feeling where some people in those types of systems don't feel very wealthy, but to replicate the income they get from that pension with a pile of money of their own or their own investments might be millions of dollars that they otherwise couldn't accomplish if they just tried to save in that way.
When you sign up and start paying into para, if you get a job that qualifies for it, do they do a very good job of explaining that to you? Or you're kind of having to self-educate on how it's all set up?
I think para and its team and the employers would disagree with the employees about that. I think most employees would say they didn't feel very well educated. I think the para people and anybody who runs a pension, not just para, would probably point to like a website and brochures and webinars and seminars every month and like education programs and counseling, like all these resources to help you get it. And it's just not used very much. And it's not taken up on very much. And then consequently as well, there's then a problem where they, have all the resources, but if they don't read the book, they don't learn from it. To just sort of put it in those terms. I find that a lot of pension participants, para and otherwise, often say that they learned a lot more about their pension via sort of tribal knowledge, right? Their fellow coworkers who are ahead of them in their careers have told them something. And there's a problem with that, which is, of course, your fellow coworkers are not always a reliable source of information. And consequently, there can be an issue there where they've gotten information, but the quality of it varies dramatically.
Well, and isn't it pretty person specific? Like for one person, maybe you should take the lump sum, but for the next person, you definitely shouldn't.
And that's a perfect example of it, right? Your one coworker might say you should always take the income. There's no reason not to, but they may not be aware that you have a family history of heart disease or cancer or Alzheimer's, Lou Gehrig's, something that tends to kick in as you get up there in years that might make the income benefit not worth it for you, or vice versa, right? They say you should just take the lump sum benefit. The income's not worth it, but everybody in your family lives to 105, and you're going to make out like a bandit on that income benefit. It's such an individual question. And particularly, it gets very nuanced when you have substantial earnings differences between the para participant or the pension participant and the spouse or the individual in the household who doesn't work in that type of system, where it can feel like one, has $1 million and the other one has nothing, but it's just because one of them has a pension, one of them has a 401k plan.
Yeah, I guess we do see that a lot. Okay.
Sure. I think the other part too is what is the legacy you want to leave? The one trade-off with a lot of pensions, annuities, para, all those is that you often have very little survivor's benefit. There's sometimes a thing where you reduce your income by, let's say, a quarter of the value of the potential pension, but then it'll last as long as both you and your spouse are still alive. And that might work great depending on your ages and your health and all those various factors. But in turn, then often there's an issue, particularly for single retirees under those types of systems, where essentially, if they retire on their 65th birthday and they get hit by a bus tomorrow, their life savings essentially just goes poof. And that goes to the benefit of other participants in that pension plan. But that can also be a big sort of inherited wealth, family wealth, legacy wealth disparity between people who do have big liquid investment retirement accounts and people who have pensions.
Would you advise someone then who's really worried about that to take that lump sum and invest it elsewhere, managed by them or someone else, so they can leave it to their kids?
That really comes back to their life expectancy, their family dynamics. Not to wander into this topic too much, but like the common example of like the person who's retiring and owns their home free and clear and their mortgage is paid off and they don't have kids or anybody like that. And so there's just sort of a natural question for a financial planner to say, well, if you're not planning on leaving the house to anybody in particular, or the house is not like where you raised your family for generations or something really personal and special like that, why not just do a reverse mortgage? Why not take the equity out of it and improve your quality of life in your own retirement at that point? So it's sort of the same question in terms of the pension stuff. Taking out the lump sum and investing it is probably going to create a suboptimal retirement income scenario for somebody who is going to have a long, happy, healthy retirement. But there are definitely circumstances where you'd say, the pension income is great, but it's not going to leave much behind for your family. And if that's what's important to you, that's a factor to consider.
I suppose so. Is that something that they talk about when they do estate planning then, and that whole kind of section of planning that we do? We cover that?
I mean, you haven't taken that class yet. So you talk about that a lot. But as financial planners in the education sense, we tend to learn a lot more about the tax impacts of passing away, both estate tax at the federal level, estate tax at the state level. And then we learn a whole bunch about trusts and gifting and inheritance strategies to make it so that there's more money passing through to the family or charity or, friends or whoever it is you want to inherit this stuff, instead of having money get sent to the state or to the government. Because in total fairness, I think we're all glad that we pay taxes in the U.S. and that we get all the benefits of that. But we'd all rather our kids or our grandkids or our friends or our community received our life savings instead of giving a huge chunk of it to the government.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think there's another issue we've run into on a similar subject, which is the inheritance of particular accounts. So we're dealing right now with one household or one family where a second spouse has passed away. So one spouse passed away first. Now the second spouse has passed away. And so things are passing on to their kids and their family. And then another scenario where the first spouse has passed away. And we're seeing two really different sets of issues with each of those. But Emily, I'm going to put you on the spot here. What are you seeing as sort of the big question or issue that's emerging for the family where the second parent or the second spouse has passed away?
From what I've seen, if both partners are gone and it's now left up to the kids, is that people often think their estate is set up. Maybe I have a will, or I put my spouse as a beneficiary on this account, and then I forgot to update it when they passed before I did, and they think everything is neat and tidy. And it's actually kind of a big mess for their kids to try and track everything down, and hopefully things don't get sent to probate, but they often seem to.
I think that's a kind of a fair set of concerns and considerations. When you've passed away, you will not be here to clarify things, number one. But I think it really highlights the importance of staying up to date on it. In particular, all your beneficiary designations, making sure that that's all set. I know in one case for this particular family, a account that was previously going to be left to the spouse never got updated. That spouse passed away first. There were no contingent or backup beneficiaries. And so now it's just going to go through probate, which in this case, they have a will and various things to take care of that. But it just adds this layer of headache that they otherwise could have avoided if they'd been better able to stay on top of it. And also there's just now the issue of family members inheriting a lot of retirement accounts, which come with their own special rules.
Right. Can't you, if it's an inherited account, you can have up to 10 years to take it out as long as you're not a spouse, but you have to take it out before that 10-year mark.
There's really three special categories here. One is just sort of eligible inheritors. A spouse is the most common example of this, but in their scenario, they can either potentially combine it with their own retirement account, or depending on the age differentials, they might be able to keep it in the original and be able to draw it based on their deceased spouse's life expectancy. The 10-year part you're talking about is more for non-eligible beneficiaries. So these are going to be adult children, friends, families. And in that particular case, or in that scenario, often the issue that arises here is that you've inherited money and a tax problem. Because you're correct, you have 10 years to take it out, but in that 10-year timeline, you can take it out bit by bit over time or all at once, but you have 10 years to do it. And so if you're, let's say, a student, or you are already retired and you have a very low income, or you're just taking a sabbatical from work and you're taking some time off, you might be able to take that money out at a low tax rate, and that would be great for you. But conversely, if you're in your prime earning years of your life, you're at the peak of your career, then you might already be in really high tax brackets, like the 32 or 35% tax bracket. And unless you're planning on quitting or retiring, or something changes in your life in the next 10-year time frame, you might have to pay a huge portion of the inheritance out just back into taxes, solely because of your personal tax rate as opposed to the tax rate of the person who left it behind, or even compared to the tax rates of other people who are inheriting it. If one person is, let's say, a teacher and one person's a CEO, the teacher is probably going to end up paying less taxes on their IRA distributions than the CEO is.
But that's not counting Roth accounts, right? That's just pre-tax?
Correct. Roth accounts, you're going to receive tax-free. So in that scenario, ideally, if you can afford to, if you don't need the money for some reason, you can just let that sit in the Roth for the next 10 years and then take it all out as a lump sum at the very end, having gotten tax-free treatment for all of that the whole way. And then otherwise, you just have non-retirement accounts. And in that case, you've got a whole mix mash of whether there were pay on death or transfer on death instructions, or if it's going to pass into a trust or go through probate. You've got to update the cost basis based on when the people passed away. So it's a lot messier, but it may actually have a lower tax impact than inheriting just a traditional IRA or a pre-tax 401k account.
Do you see that a lot of people have their primary beneficiaries and contingents, or a lot of people just skip that step and leave it for later, and that's the problem?
I see the primary all the time. A ton of people skip contingents because it's often my spouse, them, me, and then there's sort of this assumption that they're going to, I'll outlive them or they'll outlive me. And then, if that happens, when that happens, they'll update stuff. But I mean, let's just play a hypothetical here. Let's say you both live to 100 years old. How on top of your finances and your estate stuff are you going to be at that age? And I don't mean just to talk down to any centurions out there. You've outlived us all. But, it can be a complicated, stressful, difficult thing to do on top of having just lost your life partner. And so I think it's much better to get stuff laid out well in advance. And then if you have the faculties and the capacity and all that to get things updated when that happens, great. But at least then you already had sort of your backup scenario in mind from the get-go.
Right. Or I guess if they're both together and they pass away in a car accident.
Well, and that's what the contingent beneficiary is mostly for, is, hey, if you both happen to pass away at the same time, here's your out.
Do you find that they just forget once they have kids, since they're the most common contingent?
Not that they forget. I do see a lot of kids as contingent beneficiaries. What I often see actually here is a concern around the kids inheriting the money. And so sometimes there's sort of this mental avoidance game where parents will be like, well, I'll list my spouse or, the other parent, as it were, on the accounts. And then, when the kids are older, we'll add them on. But until then, I'm going to assume my spouse outlives me, and I don't really want my kids directly inheriting this big account potentially. Because that is a real problem. If you've got a 10-year-old, it might be tax-wise beneficial for them to inherit from all the RMD reasons and rules, but it may not be optimal from hey, maybe this 10-year-old shouldn't have $1 million 401k.
Right. I suppose most people don't want to do that.
No. Well, we've chatted for a healthy bit of time here, so let's just wrap up. You've been studying for your Series 7. You've taken a retirement planning class. What so far in your financial journey or your financial planning education have you learned that you think is the most important thing for anybody out there to know or have a better understanding of?
The most helpful thing is actually something we've not touched on at all today, but automating and doing even a little bit is better than nothing. I found that I save very easily when it just automatically comes out of my paycheck. Even if it was a very small amount, $50 a month, it gets me into the habit of doing it. And then I can scale up whenever I do get a chunk of money or a raise or whatever. It's already in place. And that would apply to a lot of the people in my personal life that I talk to, is just get it in place and automate it, and you could scale up later.
Well, start early, start often. It's good wisdom. All right. Well, thanks for chatting with me, and we'll talk again next week.
All right. Happy to be here.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.